Now, this video is going to be part 3 of my deep dive into The Force Awakens, and don't worry if you haven't seen the first 2 parts, they're not required viewing for this one, but if you do want to check them out either before or after, links to them will be in the description below. And before I get started here, just a few quick things. First of all, a lot of this is going to be straight up nitpicking, so if you don't like that sort of thing, this might not be the video series for you. If, however, you want to disagree with me about something that I am nitpicking, that's fine, and by all means, do leave a comment below, please. But if your comment is just going to say that I'm nitpicking something, I'll respond by saying, yes, I know, that's part of the point of these videos. And speaking of disagreeing with me, a lot of people disagreed with my assessment of Finn's character from the last video in this series, telling me they thought his behavior and actions are perfectly in line with a character who had experienced trauma, even when he rather thoughtlessly gunned down his fellow stormtroopers in the hangar bay when he and Poe were escaping. My argument, however, was that if the death of a fellow stormtrooper had been what caused the trauma in the first place, it's hard to believe he'd so quickly and without thought or remorse kill more of them, that there'd be no moment of reflection during or after he killed a couple dozen of the very thing he used to be and could empathize with, especially again after the death of one is what seemed to cause the change in him in the first place. And this is going to be a horrible example, so forgive me in advance, but if you had a beloved pet, like a dog, and you saw it get hit and killed by a car and were traumatized by that, you might have a moment of hesitation if a situation came up, as crazy as it sounds, where your life was somehow on the line and in order to escape, you had to run over a bunch of dogs with your car, or at the very least, you'd pause and reflect at some point after the fact. And obviously in The Force Awakens, these weren't dogs, but instead they were his fellow troopers that he had been raised with his whole life, and when he sees one of them killed, it rocks his world. Yet, not even a day later, he has no issue gunning down a bunch of them. And I'm sorry if I find that a little hard to believe. Anyway, let's now get to it. So without further ado, let's watch some Star Wars. Okay, so one thing I've seen many people complain about is that Rey seems to know the Millennium Falcon better than Han Solo, and they want to say this just adds to her overall Mary Sue status. However, Rey knowing the Falcon so well was not meant to in any way, shape, or form show up Han Solo or to imply she knows the ship better. Her caring and knowledge of the Falcon was supposed to be something these two characters could instantly bond over. It's meant to give Han a reason to like her and to so quickly offer her a job, as we'll soon see, which is then meant to make us the audience like and bond with this character of Rey even more, since one of our favorite heroes of all time has quickly taken a liking to her. Now sure, it may come off as, look, Rey knows everything about everything, but if we look a little deeper, the movie does try to explain her knowledge of the Falcon. That she knows its history, who stole it from who, and that she tried to tell Han earlier that Unkar Plutt had made some modifications, and it's not a stretch to assume she may have helped him make those modifications, and hence is very familiar with them. And no, that's not to say there isn't some things in this movie that Rey is good at that don't get an explanation at all, but in this case, the movie does a fine job of explaining how she seems to know so much about the Falcon, and even more than Han knows in this instance, because really, she only knows about the changes made to it that he couldn't know about. And again, it's all about trying to sell to us, the audience, that Han would immediately start to care about Rey, and why she will apparently inherit the Falcon at the end of the movie. Okay, now this is a moment in the movie I've had a lot of fun discussions about with people. Some feel that when Rey says, "I didn't know there was this much green in the whole galaxy," that Han gives her this look of guilt, which implies he knows something more about Rey than he's letting on, like she's his daughter. However, I've always thought the look Han gives was more like a, wow, you really never have been off of Jakku if you think this is a lot of green. Especially considering Han's been all over the galaxy, and he's seen places like Kashyyyk, which are far more green than even Takodana is. Okay, so this scene again really works because we know Han has started to take a liking to Rey and that he thinks she'll be useful, hence he offers her a job. And hey, let's not forget that in A New Hope before the Battle of Yavin, Han offers a job to Luke too, because he's now seen how good he is in a fight and that he can handle himself, or that he'll be useful. And really, one of the big things this movie tries to set up or sell us on is that Rey should be devastated after seeing Kylo Ren kill Han Solo later on. And that's not going to happen if these two aren't shown forming some type of bond over something, if Han isn't shown to be some sort of father-type figure to the lonely Rey. Simply put, all of it, from her knowing the Falcon to Han offering her a job here, it's set up to make Rey truly begin to hate Kylo Ren, or to give her more reason to hate him, which should set up an interesting dynamic between our two main characters for the trilogy. And I really wish the next movie had been more about Luke trying to convince Rey that there was still good in Ben, and not the other way around, not Rey trying to convince Luke of that. But I digress. And here we learn that apparently the Falcon isn't a clean ship, that there's some sort of tracker on it or way that it can be tracked that Han and Chewie used to find it in the first place, and now it needs to be dealt with, I'd assume. And let's never mind the fact that only now were they able to find it, presumably because the ship had been powered down for years. Yet before, in this very movie, Rey had gone through a long list of people who had stolen it from each other, and apparently Han and Chewie were never able to track it those times, or when others were probably flying around in it. But what's even more confusing is that Han says the First Order is likely tracking the ship too, and that's the reason they don't go straight to Dakar where the Resistance base is. Yet later on, the Falcon flies there anyway. And most likely this isn't an issue since the real reason Han didn't want to go straight to Dakar was because he didn't want to see Leia, or thought she didn't want to see him. But if that is the case, if there is no tracker, then how did Han and Chewie find the Falcon in the first place, and so quickly? Especially again when they hadn't been able to find it years prior, when it was changing hands multiple times. Okay, this was easily one of my favorite moments in the movie. This was what I was, in part, hoping for out of the sequel trilogy. A story that dealt with the aftermath and lasting legacy of both Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader, what those two characters would mean to or how they would affect the next generation. And I love this idea that Kylo Ren is communing with, or thinks he's communing with, his grandfather right here. That he's trying to carry on or finish his legacy. And really, I thought Rey would represent the opposite side. That Anakin Skywalker, through his lightsaber, was somehow sending her to Luke to be trained to stop Kylo Ren or to bring him back to the light. I thought this might very well be the basis of the whole trilogy. That it would be about Vader versus Anakin via proxy. And those proxies would of course be Rey and Kylo Ren. And now we come to yet another moment I've had a lot of debates over. When Maz Kanata asks Han, "Who's the girl?" and the movie immediately cuts away before he can respond. Now, some feel this is done to hide the fact that Han is about to tell her something that they, the filmmakers, don't want us, the audience, to know just yet. However, I'd argue the reason Maz asks in the first place is because she's intrigued or senses something, and keep in mind Maz Kanata is Force sensitive, and she just wants to know where Han found Rey. And the reason the movie cuts away is because Han doesn't know much more about Rey than her name and where she comes from, nothing we the audience don't already know and don't need to see reiterated. As I see it, the fact that Maz is curious about Rey is meant to be the intriguing part in itself. It's not meant to be intriguing because some kind of truth spoken by Han is being kept from us. And honestly, how would Han know anything about Rey at this point? At the very most, he might suspect something, but he doesn't really give us that indication. The first thing he wants to do is put Rey and Finn in an escape pod and leave them on the first inhabitable planet. Then when he offers her a job and she turns him down, all he really does is say that's a shame and walks away. If he truly thought this was his long-lost daughter, which some people want to believe, don't you think he'd be eager to go and see Leia with her, since if this theory is true, that they have a lost daughter, that would likely be what split them up in the first place. Don't you think he'd want to bring his daughter home to Leia, not avoid her at all cost? So basically, two things this movie is trying to do, make Rey intriguing and build up a relationship between her and Han, are being seen as or confused as subtly hinting that Rey is Han's daughter, when I fully believe and feel that it's not the case at all or what they're trying to even imply. As I've said before, this movie wants you to get the impression that Han cares about Rey and Rey sees Han as a father figure so that his death will have an impact on her. It's really that simple. Okay, now this here is a fine scene where Finn tells Rey he's a stormtrooper or was a stormtrooper, that he's not with the Resistance, and that he just wants to run from the First Order. But this is where I'll take a moment to again lament the fact that more wasn't done with Finn in general. Because his story arc was as simple as, I need to run from the First Order, I need to keep running from the First Order, and then I need to overcome my fear and save Rey. And it's not that it's a bad arc, it's just that I was really hoping for more out of his character in general because it was an interesting idea, a stormtrooper who deserted, but they really just went with a cookie-cutter arc for it, and it was disappointing. Not to mention, it left little room for change or progression with him in the next movie. Okay, so I could probably ramble on about this scene for a while, the Force flashback I mean. I could probably make a whole video just on this, so I'll try to keep it very brief and concise. It's at this point when we see that the lightsaber that once belonged to Luke and his father before him is now calling out to Rey that two possibilities seem likely. Either the saber itself is somehow recognizing one of its own it's recognizing that Rey is a Skywalker and calling out to her, or it's being used by perhaps the Force ghosts like Anakin to help send Rey to Luke. That somehow she has been chosen by Anakin to go and find Luke, and then likely to stop Kylo Ren after she's trained. Again, I feel like this movie is setting up an Anakin vs. Vader type scenario, and to me that sounds pretty cool. As for the flashback itself, I do wonder how much J.J. Abrams had a plan for, or a story or idea behind, and how much he put in there with the intent on figuring out later, if ever. I mean, did he have a reason in mind for why the Saber, or the Force Ghost, I suppose, showed Rey, Kylo Ren, and the Knights of Ren slaughtering all those people? Did he have it all or mostly thought out, or did he just think this was cool imagery? And did he have the whole story about who'd left Rey behind and why sorted out? Or again, did it look cool and it was meant to be a good story to figure out another time? In other words, I want to know if he did or didn't have a very specific reason for picking the imagery that he did for this scene. And this little speech or pep talk here by Maz to Rey, to me said that of my previous options, Rey was not going to be a Skywalker, and that instead, the Saber was calling out to her in order to send her to Luke. Maz even says that Rey already knows the truth, that whoever she's waiting for on Jakku is never coming back, and Rey doesn't try to dispute this. She then says but one still could, which of course means Rey could still bring Luke back. Maz then says the belonging you seek is not behind, but ahead, which to me was meant to say that who Rey was or where she came from is not as important as where she's going or who she'll become, which is a very Disney-type message to send. And now before wrapping this part up, I have to very quickly comment on what just might be the most annoying scene in all of Star Wars to me. Not the worst, mind you, just the most annoying. That being when the people on Takodana look up into the sky and can see the destruction of the Hosnian system clear as day, despite the fact that the Hosnian system is countless light years away, and there is no possible way they should be able to see that, not to mention the streaking laser too. I get that they're going for dramatic effect here, and it's not like Star Wars has always or ever strictly adhered to the laws of physics, but this one was pretty bad. I mean, depending on just how far apart these systems are, and I didn't even want to look at a galactic map to see, the light from the explosion would take years to get there, maybe even hundreds, if not thousands, or tens of thousands of years, again depending on distance. And even when it did get there, at most it might be a tiny red dot in the sky where a star used to be, not a giant explosion. And as I alluded to before in this series, when it comes to space travel and the laws of physics and all of that in Star Wars, the story will only adhere to them when it suits the story. Otherwise, those things will just adhere to the story. And normally, I won't get too upset at that, but in this case, it's just gross negligence. And that's where I'll pause on this for now. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me if you agree or disagree with my assessments here. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.